Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we cut through the noise and distill the most important knowledge from a rich stack of sources.
Today we're looking at a life that was intensely spiritual, deeply political, and quite often really contradictory.
We are embarking on a deep dive into the singular journey of Desmond Tutu, the global figure who evolved from a sickly boy in a segregated nation into the relentless moral compass of South Africa and, well, later, the world.
Indeed. Tutu is a figure so universally recognized, the smiling face of post-apartheid reconciliation, that his complexity often gets flattened.
Right.
The sources reveal he was far more than just an activist. He was a theologian who strategically fused Black and African theology into a practical, almost revolutionary form of resistance.
And he embodied all these contradictory tensions, didn't he?
Completely. The socialist who appreciated the trappings of church hierarchy, the liberation hero who became the ANC's most consistent internal critic, and the advocate for forgiveness who later demanded global retributive justice.
That's our mission today.
Right.
To give you a thorough, analytical, and efficient understanding of these layers. We want to know how his faith provided the strategic framework for dismantling apartheid.
And what the actual, often painful philosophy was behind his vision of reconciliation.
Exactly. And how his unwavering moral stance put him in uncompromising conflict with some of the most powerful people on earth, including his former allies.
His life demonstrates something really profound about power. I mean, he never sought political office, yet he wielded this immense power through sheer moral authority.
He provided a necessary moral clarity.
Yes, during a period of intense political and military chaos. We'll examine how his unique blend of engaged theology, a phrase he really favored, how that focused on Black suffering and African authenticity, and how it gave him the intellectual tools to be such an effective leader.
Okay, let's unpack this journey. We will start with the foundations of his voice, his childhood and clerical formation, then move through his rise as the anti-apartheid vanguard and Nobel laureate.
Then his critical role in the transition as Archbishop, and finally, his monumental work chairing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Before turning his gaze outward as a global human rights crusader.
To understand the fearless public figure, we really have to recognize the vulnerability and the challenges that shaped his earliest years. Desmond Tutu, and his middle name, Impilo, means life in Nososa, was born in 1931 in Klerksdorp.
Into a relatively poor family of mixed Xhosa and Botswana heritage, and critically, he was a sickly child.
Yes, and the extent of that physical vulnerability is just crucial context.
He contracted polio, which led to the atrophy of his right hand, and then, most severely, he was hospitalized for a staggering 18 months with tuberculosis starting in 1947.
A year and a half.
Spending a year and a half of your teenage life institutionalized, struggling for health, that profoundly shapes your worldview.
And it was that experience, ironically, that set him on his professional path. During his long hospitalization, he was regularly visited by an Anglican priest named Trevor Huddleston.
A key figure.
Oh, a biographer noted that Huddleston was the greatest single influence in Tutu's life. Huddleston was a white priest who showed genuine, consistent care and respect.
So that provided Tutu with a powerful early model of Christian anti-racist dedication.
It was a direct personal refutation of the entire oppressive system, right there in his hospital room.
He initially pursued medicine, which makes perfect sense given his background with illness, but his trajectory shifted.
Financial necessity. His parents just couldn't afford medicine tuition at the University of the Witwatersrand, so he trained and worked as a teacher instead, getting his BA from the University of South Africa.
And we also find that fascinating historical footnote. He graduated in the same class as Robert Mugabe,
the man who would eventually rule Zimbabwe.
a momentary parallel before their political paths sharply diverged.
Tutu's teaching career, however, was dramatically terminated by one of the most insidious pieces of apartheid legislation, the Bantu Education Act of 1953.
What exactly was it about the Bantu Education Act that was such a trigger for him?
Well, it wasn't just segregation. It was systemic oppression masked as education. The act was introduced by the nationalist government with the stated goal of ensuring that Black South Africans were taught skills appropriate for their designated role.
As manual laborers?
As manual laborers, yes, actively limiting their aspirations. Hendrik Verwoerd, one of the chief architects of apartheid, famously stated that black people would be educated in accordance with their opportunities in life.
Yelling.
Tutu saw this as a deliberate system designed to destroy the future of his students. He left teaching in utter disgust, stating he would not be an agent of such a destructive policy.
So his path was suddenly clear. If he couldn't heal bodies or elevate minds through the secular system, he would elevate souls and fight the system through the church.
But even that journey, the journey to the clergy, was stalled by personal finances.
And what does it tell us about the power dynamics of 1950s South Africa that the person who eventually resolved this debt and allowed him to enter St. Peter's Theological College was Harry Oppenheimer?
It provides an almost unbelievable irony right at the start of the future socialist's career. I mean, Oppenheimer was the wealthy industrialist and mining magnate, the absolute pinnacle of white South African capitalism.
The very system Tutu would later fiercely critique.
Exactly. The fact that the ultimate representative of the economic power structure was the one who paid the debts for the future black voice of liberation, it just encapsulates the deeply convoluted and often compromised structure of that society.
After his initial training, he moved to the UK in 1962 to deepen his theological studies at King's College London. Beyond the academic achievement, what was the psychological impact of his time abroad?
It was a vital liberation. His family experienced freedom from the indignity of apartheid and the pass laws. And while London certainly wasn't free of racism, they were not subjected to structural, daily legal oppression.
It provided a crucial sense of normalcy and equality.
Absolutely. And think about the professional experience he gained.
He ministered to a predominantly white congregation for the first time at the Church of St. Alban the Martyr in Golders Green. What did this experience enable him to do when he returned home?
The sources are very clear on this. It was a key psychological shift. Being treated as an equal, both professionally and personally, allowed him to jettison any bitterness to whites.
Crucially, it helped him overcome his habit of automatically deferring to whites.
Yes, that deep-seated psychological constraint imposed by apartheid. He returned to South Africa in 1966, not fueled by personal rage against individuals, but with an unburdened and clear-eyed resolve to dismantle the racist structure itself.
Viewing the system as the great dehumanizer of everyone, black and white.
Precisely.
Upon his return, he began teaching at institutions like the Federal Theological Seminary, becoming its first black staff member. And this exposure quickly thrust him into conflict with state power.
Yes, his political consciousness crystallized further at Fort Hare in 1968. He witnessed police brutally suppressing student dissent there, using dogs and batons.
And his response was immediate.
Immediate and physical. It defined his method of activism. He waded into the violence, using his clerical collar and his physical presence to pray with the surrounded protesters. This was his first defining act of using moral authority to intercede against state violence.
This professional exposure also accelerated the formation of his unique theological methodology. He spent time as the Tubia Africa director, touring the continent.
And absorbing various currents of liberation thought, he was attracted to black theology, but he sought to fuse it with African theology.
And this is the intellectual foundation of his public life. It's so important to analyze this fusion.
It is. Black theology was an engaged, not an academic, detached theology, born out of the raw experience of black suffering and demanding liberation from oppression.
But he felt that wasn't enough.
No, it was often viewed as just reactive to Western oppression. So he synthesized it with African theology, which focused on authenticity, cultural affirmation, and rejecting the supremacy of Western values.
So how did this unique blend inform his strategic choices against apartheid?
Because he approached the problem from two angles simultaneously. Black theology gave him the language of protest and suffering, confirming that God was on the side of the oppressed.
In African theology.
That gave him the language of construction and universal human worth, the idea that the liberation of the black majority was inextricably linked to the liberation of the white minority, because those who enact institutional violence dehumanize themselves in the process.
So he wasn't just fighting against something.
He was fighting for a shared, authentic African humanity. That intellectual grounding made his critique so powerful and universal.
By the mid-1970s, Tutu's intellectual foundations translated into tangible institutional power. He gained these groundbreaking appointments. First, Black Dean of St. Mary's Cathedral in Johannesburg in 1975.
And then Bishop of Lesotho. These roles gave him a platform that very few other critics of apartheid possessed.
And he immediately leveraged that platform through conscious, visible protest.
Absolutely. When he became Dean of St. Mary's, he was entitled to reside in the official dean's residence in the white suburb of Houghton. He flatly refused.
He chose instead to live in a house in Orlando West, Soweto, a largely impoverished black area.
That was more than just a preference, wasn't it? That was a living, daily political statement.
It lent him immediate, immense moral credibility among the black majority by choosing solidarity over privilege.
He didn't just speak from the pulpit, he shared the lived experience of the oppressed. And he immediately used this capital as a public prophet. In May 1976, he wrote his famous letter to Prime Minister B.J. Vorster.
The prophetic warning?
Yes, he warned Vorster directly that the country would erupt in racial violence if the government continued its oppressive policies. And the timing, as you noted, is just chilling.
Just 6 weeks later, the Soweto uprising began.
Ignited by a protest against mandatory Afrikaans language instruction, leading to hundreds of deaths, mostly young students.
And his response to the bloodshed was uncompromising. He publicly condemned the deafening silence of white South Africans.
He directly challenged them in his sermon, asking if they would exhibit the same nonchalance if white youths had been shot and killed by the police. He was leveraging his position fearlessly.
And that position was formalized in 1978 when he became General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches, the SACC.
This was a critical appointment because the SACC was one of the few institutions in the country where black people had the majority representation, and he was its first black leader.
Why was the SACC such a unique political vehicle?
Because it provided a moral mandate that transcended purely political organizations like the ANC, which was banned at the time.
Right.
He defined the SACC's mission very carefully, stating it was neither a black nor a white organization, but a Christian one with a necessary bias in favor of the oppressed and the exploited. This framing allowed him to criticize the regime without being labeled a partisan political operative.
It kept his moral authority intact.
Exactly.
His activism brought consequences, which in turn escalated his profile internationally. He led a protest march in 1980 that resulted in his arrest.
But the government's attempts to silence him backfired spectacularly when they confiscated his passport. Twice.
The government essentially grounded their most visible opponent, thinking they could limit his influence.
And instead, this administrative action turned him into an international cause célèbre. It prevented him from personally collecting several honorary degrees, which forced the global media to cover why he couldn't travel.
This enforced visibility on the world stage was an accidental masterstroke in raising his profile.
A huge miscalculation on their part.
Let's discuss the strategy of foreign economic pressure. This was highly contentious. Many argued that sanctions would disproportionately hurt the black majority.
And he was very pragmatic and blunt about that. He argued that the impoverished black population was already experiencing significant hardship, and that this hardship was meaningless.
So if they were going to suffer,
it would be better if they were suffering with a purpose, that purpose being liberation. He accepted short-term economic pain as a necessary catalyst for long-term freedom. This required immense moral conviction.
he was essentially asking the oppressed to endure even more suffering for a collective future.
A very difficult position to take.
And even while advocating for pressure, he still engaged in dialogue with the regime, meeting unsuccessfully with Prime Minister P.W. Botha in 1980. Why bother?
He framed it in deeply theological terms. He used the powerful biblical analogy. Moses went to Pharaoh repeatedly to secure the release of the Israelites.
It shows his commitment to exhausting every tool, moral suasion, dialogue, global pressure.
All tied to a deeply Christian conviction that engagement must precede condemnation.
This relentless pressure culminates in the 1984 Nobel Peace Prize. And we have a crucial analytical nugget here. His selection wasn't purely based on merit, but on strategic political calculation tied to the Cold War.
That is the critical point. He had been nominated repeatedly, but 1984 was the moment of strategic utility. The Nobel Committee recognized his role as a unifying leader figure and was explicitly supporting the SACC.
But more importantly, he was a less controversial choice than the other major figures.
Exactly. Nelson Mandela, while globally revered by many, was imprisoned and linked to the armed wing of the ANC and, critically for the U.S., the South African Communist Party.
So he was politically acceptable where Mandela was not.
Precisely. Tutu was a fierce anti-apartheid advocate, yes, but he had no communist links. In the highly polarized context of the Cold War, this made his message palatable to Western governments, especially the Reagan administration.
They were nervous about supporting anything that smacked of Soviet influence.
So he offered the world a moral, non-communist face of the anti-apartheid movement, and that accessibility was instrumental in turning international public opinion and securing foreign pressure.
That contextualizes his global appeal perfectly. Yet, while he was internationally compared to Martin Luther King Jr., he was simultaneously under attack.
At home and abroad, by white conservatives. Figures like Pat Buchanan and Jerry Falwell attacked him as an alleged communist sympathizer, ignoring the fact that he was fiercely anti-Marxist.
And at the same time, the South African government was running its own campaign.
A concerted covert campaign run by the State Security Council's Stratcom wing to discredit him. This included printing anti-Tutu slogans, paying people to protest him, and constantly misquoting him to erode his credibility.
But his Nobel acceptance speech really transcended all of that political fray.
It was a direct, empathetic address to the victims. He emphasized that the award was not for him, but for the millions suffering, for the mothers separated from their children, for those whose shacks were destroyed.
And for the 3.5 million people who have been uprooted and dumped as if you were rubbish.
He used the prize money not for personal gain, but to fund his family, support the SACC staff, and establish a scholarship fund for South Africans in exile.
Moving into the mid-1980s, Tutu moved to the very apex of institutional power, first as Bishop of Johannesburg, and then in 1986 as Archbishop of Cape Town.
In both cases, he was the first Black African to hold these posts.
This should have been a moment of unity, but it actually created intense internal conflict within the church.
It was a profoundly dividing moment for the Anglican Church in Southern Africa. Many white Anglicans saw his appointment as a politicization of the church. They responded by leaving the church entirely or withdrawing their financial support.
So he faced an immediate internal schism.
Driven by racism and resistance to change, yes.
Despite that internal turmoil, he immediately used his position to push a progressive agenda for the church itself.
His agenda was remarkably ahead of its time for such a conservative institution. He explicitly oversaw the introduction of female priests, comparing the exclusion of women from the priesthood directly to the injustices of apartheid.
He also appointed openly gay priests to senior positions.
Yes, and he privately criticized the church's requirement for them to remain celibate. He saw inclusivity as a theological imperative, not a political preference.
With the country descending into factional violence in the mid to late 1980s, how did he manage to lead a divided church while mediating a collapsing nation?
His leadership style was rooted in traditional African custom, a commitment to consensus building. He didn't seek simple majority votes among competing factions. He often insisted on continuing discussions until all parties could reach a compromise and a unanimous vote.
He understood that unity required every voice to be heard,
including the dissenting ones.
During this chaotic period, Tutu often spoke at the funerals of young Black activists killed in clashes. This positioned him in a difficult middle ground, didn't it? It forced him to anger militants within the anti-apartheid movement itself.
This is the painful tightrope he walked. He openly spoke against the torture and killing of suspected collaborators, specifically condemning the brutal practice of necklacing, burning victims alive with a tire.
And that stance infuriated certain Black militants who viewed his calls for nonviolence as an obstacle to the revolution.
For radical elements, this was war. They argued that Tutu's moral high ground was a luxury they couldn't afford. The sources note he was viewed suspiciously by both hostile sides, too radical for the white government and too moderate for the Black militants.
He was risking his life, speaking truth to both.
Absolutely. And while he risked alienating parts of the Black liberation movement, the state continued its psychological campaign to destroy his credibility.
They amplified their Stratcom tactics.
Yes, they tried to portray him as a champagne socialist, out of touch with his poor base. They deemed him too high profile to assassinate, but they worked relentlessly to erode his moral capital through misinformation.
Yet, he continued active civil disobedience, notably protesting at segregated beaches outside Cape Town. A critical turning point came in 1989 when the new president, F.W. de Klerk, permitted a multiracial march he led through Cape Town.
And that permission was a huge sign that the government's resolve was crumbling. That march included an estimated 30,000 people from all races. It was a massive show of multiracial unity and defiance that the state did not dare stop.
It inspired similar defiance across the country.
And it signaled to the world that negotiation, not revolution, was imminent.
He also showed his pragmatic power during a fierce personal confrontation with President P.W. Botha in 1988 regarding the fate of the Sharpeville Six.
Botha was known for his stubborn, aggressive stance. The meeting was incredibly antagonistic. Both accused Tutu of supporting terrorism. Tutu, while reiterating his rejection of violence, fiercely argued the moral case for clemency.
And critically, that argument was productive. The death sentences for the Sharpeville Six were ultimately commuted.
It demonstrated that even a hardline regime felt compelled to respond to Tutu's moral leverage, especially as international pressure peaked.
By 1990, the negotiations for dismantling apartheid began. Tutu was centrally involved in mediating that tense transition.
He praised de Klerk's decision to lift the ban on the ANC, and his relationship with Nelson Mandela became intensely close immediately after Mandela's release.
Mandela and his wife Winnie stayed at Tutu's official residence, Bishop's Court, on the very first night of his freedom,
cementing Tutu's role as the spiritual advisor to the transition.
However, the early 1990s were marked by brutal, volatile violence between ANC supporters and the Inkatha Freedom Party. Tutu found himself mediating what could have dissolved into a full-scale civil war.
That mediation was perhaps the highest-stakes work of his life. Had that factional violence escalated into an unstoppable conflict, the negotiated settlement would have collapsed.
And despite his strained personal relationship with Inkatha leader Mangosuthu Buthelezi,
whom Tutu strongly disliked due to Buthelezi's support for the Bantustan system, Tutu repeatedly visited him, urging his involvement in the democratic process. His impartiality was vital to keeping Buthelezi at the table.
And it was during this violence that the third force theory gained widespread traction.
Yes. Tutu and many activists believed that a hidden third force was actively stoking the ANC-Inkatha clashes. And this was later proven true. Intelligence agencies were supplying Inkatha with weapons to deliberately weaken the ANC's position.
Tutu's moral intuition was correct.
But he pragmatically maintained distance, refusing to personally accuse de Klerk of complicity, which preserved the negotiating atmosphere.
The ultimate payoff arrived with the 1994 multiracial general election.
He was just joyfully exuberant. He understood the immense symbolic weight of the moment, allowing his face to be used on posters encouraging voting.
And he carefully choreographed the religious component of Mandela's inauguration,
insisting on including Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and Hindu leaders. This was his vision of the rainbow people of God materialized, a powerful visualization of the multiracial future.
After the election, the new nation faced the moral challenge of moving forward without descending into cycles of retribution. Nelson Mandela tasked Tutu with defining this moral architecture, appointing him to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC.
This was the intellectual and emotional crucible of Tutu's career. The TRC was designed to investigate human rights abuses committed by all sides, pro-apartheid security forces and anti-apartheid groups alike.
He was the chief architect of the process.
And he rejected the standard Western punitive criminal justice system in favor of restorative justice. His model was explicitly based on a threefold approach:
confession, forgiveness, and restitution.
Exactly. Confession, where perpetrators were required to fully disclose their politically motivated activities. Forgiveness, offered in the form of legal amnesty from prosecution for those who confessed fully and truthfully. And restitution, requiring perpetrators to make amends.
This model emphasized the spirit of Ubuntu,
characteristic of traditional African jurisprudence rather than Western retribution.
The concept of Ubuntu is so central to his work, but it's often reduced to a simple feel-good phrase. How did he define this complex African philosophy?
Tutu provided a deeply humanist and lyrical definition. Ubuntu refers to gentleness, to compassion, to hospitality, to openness to others, to vulnerability, to be available to others, and to know that you are bound up with them in the bundle of life.
The philosophical core comes from the Xhosa saying, a person is a person through other persons.
It means your humanity is inextricably linked to mine.
So how did that translate into the legal and moral mechanism of the TRC?
It meant the TRC was focused not on simple punishment, but on the reintegration of the perpetrator back into the bundle of life after they had confessed and sought forgiveness. Confession became a path to rehumanization.
If a perpetrator denied their actions, they remained outside the circle of shared humanity.
Exactly. But if they confessed, they could potentially be restored. This sharply distinguished it from a Western criminal court, which focuses purely on establishing guilt and levying punishment.
You mentioned the emotional toll the televised public hearings took on him.
He was profoundly affected. Tutu was frequently overwhelmed by the often horrific testimony of victims, often crying publicly. He was the emotional lightning rod for the entire nation's trauma.
And he deliberately highlighted the victims who demonstrated extraordinary generosity.
Yes, those who expressed forgiveness toward their abusers. He called this forgiveness a gospel imperative. He insisted that the nation had to face its past damages openly.
But the TRC process led to a significant fracture point with his former allies in the ANC.
This was the cost of his integrity. The ANC's image was deeply tarnished by revelations that some of his activists had engaged in torture and attacks on civilians. The ANC leadership, under Thabo Mbeki, sought to suppress parts of the final TRC report that implicated its own members.
And what was Tutu's response to Mbeki's attempt to sanitize the historical record?
He was absolutely furious. He warned that the ANC was displaying a disturbing abuse of power, delivering the chilling prognosis that yesterday's oppressed can quite easily become today's oppressors.
This event marked an irreparable political break between Tutu and the Mbeki administration.
It did. Tutu prioritized moral truth over party loyalty, which set the stage for his subsequent role as a fierce internal critic.
He had coined the term Rainbow Nation as a metaphor for post-apartheid South Africa, yet he refused to sacrifice accountability for that unity.
His ideology was fundamentally moral, not political. While unwavering in his anti-apartheid core, which he likened to Nazism, he always stressed that apartheid was the enemy, not white people. He maintained that true reconciliation was only possible among equals.
Which meant facing up to the truth, regardless of which side committed the abuses.
Yes.
We also have to address his nuanced political ideology. He openly identified as a socialist, yet fiercely rejected communism. That's a massive political tightrope to walk.
It is. He criticized capitalism for encouraging some of the worst features in people, describing its ethos as eat or be eaten and survival of the fittest, which he felt eroded Ubuntu.
Yet he hated Marxism-Leninism with every fiber of my being.
His rejection of Marxism was theological and cultural. He saw Marxist-Leninist ideology as incompatible with the African spirit because of its promotion of atheism. He even famously claimed that African communism was an oxymoron, believing that Africans are intrinsically spiritual.
This allowed him to offer a critique of capitalism rooted in faith and community values, rather than in global revolutionary politics.
Keeping his distance from both Western political spheres and Soviet influence.
And his role as a cleric. He believed it was a Christian duty to oppose unjust laws, but he was always careful to avoid formal party politics.
He felt religious leaders must remain outside party politics to maintain the moral clarity necessary for their prophetic role. His authority rested on his impartiality, which became incredibly important once the ANC transitioned from a liberation movement to a ruling party that needed critique.
Tutu's life after the TRC cemented his legacy as a global human rights crusader. He didn't just retire, he became a moral auditor, practicing what he called critical solidarity.
Supporting the democratic ideal but reserving the right to publicly criticize his allies when they faltered. And he started at the top, criticizing his great friend Nelson Mandela.
His critiques of Mandela focused on structural issues that signaled the country might be failing its promise.
Two specific issues. First, Mandela's decision to retain the apartheid-era armaments industry, and second, the surprisingly high pay packets adopted by the new members of parliament.
Why did those specific issues matter enough to provoke a public critique?
Well, the armaments industry signaled continuity with the militaristic, opaque nature of the previous regime. The high MP salary signaled that the new governing class was focused on personal enrichment rather than serving the impoverished majority.
And when Tutu raised these issues publicly, which was a break from African tradition, Mandela reportedly called him a populist in response.
Yes, and the criticism only sharpened under Mandela's successors. It became almost relentless under Mbeki and Zuma.
Against Thabo Mbeki, Tutu was scathing.
He accused the ANC of demanding sycophantic, obsequious conformity and showed deep dismay over Mbeki's disastrous neglect of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which cost countless lives.
And when Jacob Zuma came to power,
Tutu criticized Zuma's moral failings following rape and corruption accusations. In a shocking political low blow, Zuma's advisor publicly questioned how Tutu could accept the apology from the apartheid government, yet cannot find it in his heart to accept the apology from Zuma.
he also extended his moral auditing north to Zimbabwe, rejecting South Africa's diplomatic position entirely.
Tutu slammed South Africa's policy of quiet diplomacy toward Robert Mugabe's increasingly tyrannical government, labeling Mugabe the caricature of an African dictator.
He even went so far as to call for a full UN peacekeeping force to be sent to Zimbabwe.
He believed silence in the face of injustice was complicity, whether in Pretoria or Harare.
Let's turn now to his international human rights advocacy, which put him at the center of several global firestorms, none more heated than his stance on gay rights.
This was arguably his most progressive and uncompromising stance, particularly for a figure of his age and faith background. He explicitly equated discrimination against homosexuals with discrimination against Black people and women.
After the Anglican Communion reaffirmed its opposition to same-sex acts in 1998, he stated he was ashamed to be an Anglican.
And his most quoted, profoundly emotional statement on this issue is one that really defines his moral universe.
I would refuse to go to a homophobic heaven.
I would not worship a God who is homophobic, and that is how deeply I feel about this. He claimed he was as passionate about this campaign as I ever was about apartheid. His commitment was so complete that in 2015, he gave a blessing at his daughter Mimfal's marriage to a woman in the Netherlands.
Actively using his authority to endorse the union.
Yes.
Next, his highly controversial position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
This stance earned him fierce global criticism. He argued that Israel's treatment of Palestinians was reminiscent of South African apartheid and repeatedly called for sanctions against Israel.
He was even named to head a UN fact-finding mission to Gaza.
A mission Israel refused to grant him clearance for, which led to its cancellation.
But his view wasn't a blanket condemnation of Israel's existence, was it?
No, and that's the nuance that often gets lost.
Yeah.
While fiercely critical of the Israeli government's policies, he still recognized Israel's right to exist and personally urged Yasser Arafat in 1989 to accept that reality.
He wanted justice and accountability for Palestinians, not the elimination of the State of Israel.
Yep.
However, the limits of his universal focus on forgiveness became evident when he delivered a sermon at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial in 1989, urging forgiveness for the perpetrators of the Holocaust.
That sermon drew immediate and significant global criticism from Jewish groups. They argued that demanding forgiveness for such crimes while the wounds were still fresh was inappropriate and misunderstood the nature of the trauma.
And Tutu exacerbated the anger by defensively referring to a Jewish lobby in the U.S.
and referencing his own Jewish dentist, Dr. Cohen, as an attempt to prove his lack of bias. This tension demonstrated that the model of restorative justice that worked in the unique context of the TRC could not be universally applied without careful consideration of historical and cultural trauma.
Moving to global politics, he took radical steps to protest the Iraq War.
He broke his personal rule on not joining protests outside South Africa to demonstrate against the Iraq War in New York City in 2003. He was not merely expressing dissent, he was demanding accountability from the most powerful figures on the world stage.
And he didn't stop at political protest. He drew direct moral parallels between global conflicts and the system he fought against.
Yes. He criticized detentions at Guantanamo Bay as utterly unacceptable, explicitly comparing them to apartheid-era detentions without trial,
suggesting that the erosion of rights was happening even in Western democracies.
This use of apartheid as a universal moral yardstick became his signature tool. And most dramatically, in 2012, he called for U.S. President George W. Bush and British Prime Minister Tony Blair to be tried by the International Criminal Court for initiating the Iraq War.
His late-life activism also extended to climate change. How did he apply that moral yardstick to environmental issues?
Recognizing the scale of the threat, he called for an apartheid-style boycott, specifically a divestment from fossil fuels to save the planet.
By equating climate change inaction with institutional apartheid, he raised the moral urgency of the issue to the highest possible level.
Arguing that those who profit from destruction are morally complicit, just as those who benefited from apartheid were complicit.
He retired from public life in 2010, stepping down as chair of the elders, but even in retirement, he made strong final statements.
In 2014, he came out in strong support of legalized assisted dying, revealing that he wanted that option open to him personally. And his final prominent public statement, published in The Guardian in December 2020, was another demand for accountability,
urging incoming U.S. President Joe Biden to declare that Israel had nuclear weapons and to eliminate all financial aid to the country.
A final, uncompromising demand.
When he died from cancer in 2021, the details of his funeral captured that blend of personal humility and institutional splendor he cultivated his entire life.
His body lay in state in a plain pine coffin, the cheapest available at his request to avoid any ostentatious displays. This reflected his profound humility and socialist ideals.
Yet it was surrounded by the full weight of the church, with his remains ultimately acclimated and interred in St. George's Cathedral.
He was a humble servant of God who commanded the respect and ceremony of a head of state.
What emerges from this deep dive is a man of extraordinary complexity. We see the extrovert, jocular personality who appreciated the symbolism and ritual of episcopal splendor, balanced by a radical, fearless stand against power.
Whether it was the brutality of apartheid or the corruption of the post-apartheid ANC.
That tension was central to his effectiveness. Biographers noted this duality. He had a deep need to be loved, but was also highly sensitive and easily hurt by criticism.
His public joy was fueled by a private discipline, a commitment to Christian principles and daily prayer, often waking at 4 a.m. for his routine. He sought consensus and love, but delivered the fiercest condemnation when necessary.
And if his scripture wasn't dogmatic, he approached faith with reason and a focus on inclusivity.
Exactly. He saw the Bible as a library of books, not a single constitutional document. He held a highly nuanced view, saying there are certain parts which you have to say no to, citing examples like accepting slavery or barring women from speaking in church.
He insisted that if the Bible conflicts with the essential message of God's love and justice, then the interpretation must change.
This flexibility allowed him to be a theological progressive and a moral universalist.
Let's synthesize his ultimate political legacy. We discussed that key nugget. His Nobel Peace Prize was not solely a recognition of his struggle, but a recognition of his strategic utility during the Cold War.
His acceptability to the U.S. government, because he strategically lacked links to the Communist Party, unlike Nelson Mandela, was instrumental. This strategic positioning provided a crucial public megaphone,
Ensuring the anti-apartheid struggle secured foreign pressure and financing that ultimately led to the regime's collapse.
His moral authority was his greatest tool, and the geopolitics of the 1980s ensured that tool could be heard internationally when the ANC itself was banned and silenced.
That sets up a powerful final question for you, the listener, to mull over. Tutu's great world-changing work as the chair of the TRC was focused entirely on restorative justice.
Demanding forgiveness from victims and looking forward to reconciliation for the sake of the nation's healing, a forward-looking vision of binding the bundle of life back together.
Yet his later career was marked by unforgiving global demands for retributive justice, calling for international trials for figures like Bush and Blair, and fierce accountability for Zuma and Mbeki in Israel.
He seemed to shift from demanding restorative healing at home to demanding retributive accountability abroad. It raises a profound moral dilemma about the applicability of justice.
How should we weigh these competing demands of restorative justice, that forward-looking forgiveness, versus retributive justice, the backward-looking demand for full accountability, in addressing systemic wrongs, both domestically after a transition and on the global stage? Tutu successfully applied a unique model to South Africa, only to spend the rest of his life challenging the world to find a system that could adequately handle both.